the second page to lay out some of the facts about the history of the line and the agreement between SNS, the foundation, and the city. We get to some representations and warranties in section A, very standard kind of legal representations and warranties. Part B is where a lot of the meat of the agreement is, so to speak, and at a high level it kind of goes through what I just talked about, but in more detail. The joint development agreement between the parties will be terminated in all respects as soon as all parties agree to actually execute this agreement, except for a few provisions which will remain in full force and effect until SNS is fully off the line by July 31st, 2022. They have a right, again, to keep the money they get between now and then. And then also there's an obligation for them to continue to keep SNS as the insured on the line, and also to add us as additional insureds. There's a little bit that the foundation and the city would have to pay with that respect, but it's capped at $12,500 or $6,250 each. And there's some protections in terms of indemnification and everything if there is in fact any issues on the northern line between now and when SNS have to be completely off by July 31st. Part C is a part that when I'm all done, Jeff Moreno can talk about a little bit more, but there's obviously, with respect to this, a bit of a complex Federal Railroad law piece, but the way we're going to effectuate the Federal Railroad piece in terms of SNS no longer being on the line with respect to Federal Railroad law under the Surface Transportation Board will be through a filing that will be made as Exhibit A here as an STB Notice of Exemption, which has to be done by March if the bodies decide to vote in favor of this agreement, which would be done by March 31st, the end of this month. Part D talks about a settlement agreement. If you remember, I was out there in November of 2020, and there was an agreement at that time. There was an escrow at that time, and by executing that agreement would be clear is no longer applicable in any way, and that any checks that have kind of been held in the interim since that time and have been in limbo as the litigations occurred, and we waited for that settlement that was pending for a long time. The checks that came in and were held would be destroyed. Part E relates to, again, issues of complex Federal Railroad law. Bottom line is the parties, everything goes according to plan, are just going to be going their complete separate ways no later than July 31st. Part F is dismissal of the current lawsuit, which has gone on for some time. It's gone on since approximately June of 2015, so coming up on 7 years. That would be dismissed within 5 business days of executing this agreement. Part G relates to attorney's fees, and Part H, other than this agreement and a few other things related to certain claims that could arise if this agreement isn't followed, the parties are releasing their claims and going their separate ways. We have a pretty robust release in Part H. Part I is personal to Mr. Williams and his daughter Ms. Beggs in terms of, and in addition to SNS, in terms of those entities no longer trying to have sort of anything to do with the Nevada Northern Railroad. Part J is a lot of legalese, so to speak, but it's important in any contract, and it's not really unique to this business deal. It's all the miscellaneous provisions. Exhibit A is the form of the notice of exemption that would be filed at the Surface Transportation Board to effectuate this agreement. And then Exhibit B is the short dismissal with prejudice that would be filed by all the attorneys in order to dismiss the state lawsuit. So if there's any questions on this proposed settlement for any officers of any of the entities, and of course for the actual board members of the city council members, or the board members of the Foundation Board of Directors, happy to answer those at this time.
Is there anyone with any questions? Okay, I'd like to now adjourn the joint meeting of the Ely City Council and Nevada Northern Railway for the Board of